good afternoon and welcome to our viewers here in Denmark, and especially good afternoon and thank you very much, Philip Goff, for being with us.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
You're an associate professor of philosophy at Durham University and the author of Galileo's Error. And there's a more scientific work as well. Isn't that correct? That's called Consciousness and Fundamental Reality.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it a scientific work, a more academic, philosophical work aimed at people with a PhD in philosophy, I guess. That's the more detailed position. That's the one I did first. And then Galileo's Error tries to explain it all in a much more accessible way to people with no background in the area.
And I don't have a PhD in philosophy, and I had an enormous pleasure out of reading and discussing Galileo's Error. I think it's just a wonderful book, and it's a very generous book, and it's a kind of book that makes you understand why philosophy is basically attractive to young people, because it asks just basic questions about consciousness and our inner life and the world and how it's all connected and the limits to our knowledge. And I think it's just a wonderful, curious and generous books that I'm so delighted that you'll talk to us about.
Oh, thank you very much. That's great to hear. Yeah, I think in many ways I'm inspired by the sort of philosophical intuitions that occur to curious 13-year-olds, where you start to think, I wonder if I'm in the Matrix. How would I know? How would I know if what it's like for me to see red is different to what it's like for you to see red? Would we ever know? And I think maybe in the 20th century, there was a period where people got a bit snobbish about those things. Oh, they're just childish philosophy. I mean, academic philosophers thought that's just childish philosophy, and you read Wittgenstein and you grow out of it. But I actually think those intuitions are solid gold, and it was a mistake to sort of treat them so harshly in that manner.
But I think it's also difficult to deal with some of these questions today, because if you look at when you read Aristotle or you read Descartes, you pretty much can access the thinking by your own rational thought as a philosopher or as a student. But today, if you want to know how the world is constructed and our consciousness and the laws of gravity, then you come up against some science that's really, really difficult. Like, I don't understand quantum physics, and I don't understand the general theory of relativity. So I think that changes philosophy a bit, that, it's like there are some scientific premises that, at least for me, are difficult to access. How do you think that changes philosophy?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm sort of jealous of people in the 17th century when it was possible to know cutting edge mathematics and cutting edge science and cutting edge philosophy. Everything is so specialized now. I just had something published in Scientific American on the on probability theory and the multiverse argument, which has been in philosophical academic journals for decades, but nobody knows about it because it's in these dense Bayesian probability calculus. So yeah, I mean, there's a real need for people to reach out and try to communicate in a way that's more accessible. And I certainly do that now. Every academic article I write, I try to write a more accessible version. And I think the reason maybe people don't do it as much is we're trained to have watertight arguments and to cover all bases and to, consider every possible objection. And when you do that, it gets very dense and it gets very complicated and the jargon comes in. So you just have to think, well, I'm going to be a bit looser. I'm going to not give every possible objection. I'm just going to write a looser piece for the sake of trying to communicate, because there's such a need. And especially with consciousness, I really think it is something that calls for interdisciplinary work. Some people think it's just a scientific question. We just need to let the neuroscientists carry on investigating the brain and we'll crack it. But I think actually we need to think about the philosophical underpinnings of the problem of consciousness. I would argue it's not just another scientific problem. There are many reasons in which it's very different from any other scientific problem. And we may even need to rethink our scientific approach in order to properly deal with it. So at those moments of time where the rules of the game are not totally fixed, that's the time you need philosophers. And that's the time you need philosophers working together with scientists. And so we have the importance of reaching out by communicating your work in a more accessible format.
And that definitely is part of the beauty of your book, is that someone is asking some very basic questions that will have consequences for our scientific worldview and what authority we give to science as we know it, and how we maintain the scientific rationality that we all appreciate and that we all want as a kind of firm foundation. I want to ask you first, what was your own road to philosophy? How did you become a philosopher yourself?
I can't remember not thinking about philosophy, really. Actually, my parents tell me that when I was 4, I asked, why are we here? although my theory is we'd actually moved house, so maybe I was just confused about the location. But, you know, I just think, I remember I was raised Catholic, actually, and I remember I asked the priest, you know, what happened to Adam and Eve when it was the Big Bang? So it's that, you know, sort of trying to fit... the drive to sort of fit things together in an overall theory of reality, and, you know, an interest in the things that don't fit, and not for the sake of it. It's not that I kind of like mystery, it's rather that I don't. I want to understand how things fit in, and there are a number of phenomena that philosophers focus on that are hard to fit into our standard scientific worldview. Free will might be one. You know, how do we fit free human agency into the scientific story of a deterministic universe, or roughly deterministic? Or facts about value, you know, how do right and wrong, good and bad, how do these kinds of facts, if they are facts, fit into the scientific story? Or facts about abstract objects like numbers and sets, you know, these kind of timeless objects, how do they fit in with the physical world? But so there are many of these phenomena. I think consciousness to me is the most fascinating, because with all of these other things, it's at least an option to just deny the phenomenon. Maybe we're not really free in the way we think we are. Maybe there aren't really facts about good and bad. Maybe it's just our subjective preferences. Some people even argue mathematics is a useful fiction. But with consciousness, it's, you know, it's so hard to deny that anyone's ever felt pain or anyone's ever seen color. It's just, the phenomenon seems so undeniable. And at the same time, it's proved so hard to fit into our standard scientific story of reality, which, as you say, many of us want to preserve. So, yeah, I mean, I've always had that drive to get it all to fit together, and that's what I try to do on consciousness in particular. And
I think we should help our viewers a bit here, because your book Galileo's Error is your suggestion of a solution to a very basic problem, and how does conscious fit in with our scientific worldview, or how do we make these? There are two positions that don't go together, and that don't explain consciousness adequately, and you offer a third position. If you just say basically, what is the problem that your book is offering a solution to?
You could simply think of it as the problem of how the brain produces consciousness. And by consciousness, I don't mean anything magical or mystical. I just mean feelings and experiences, pleasure, pain, seeing color, hearing sound. How does electrochemical signaling in the brain produce this inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes that each of us enjoys every second of waking life? So it's broadly agreed now that this is a serious challenge. As I say, I think many people think it's, oh, well, it's just another scientific question. But I think actually there are reasons this is radically different from any standard scientific challenge, and that we really need to get clear on the philosophical underpinnings of the difficulty before we can make progress. And as you say, there are a couple of traditional solutions, which when I studied philosophy, we were taught that they were the only options. On the one hand, dualism, the view that consciousness takes place in the soul, you know, supernatural entity outside of the physical workings of the body and the brain. And on the other hand, materialism, roughly the view that we can explain consciousness in terms of the electrochemical signaling in the brain. And I came to think that, you know, both of these options were deeply flawed. And actually, I just left academia and tried to forget about it altogether. But I was later led to slightly more unorthodox options that seem a bit wacky at first, but I think avoid the deep difficulties with these more traditional options. And so that's what led me back to trying to make progress on this question.
You describe an experience in your book that was changing or at least challenging your worldview radically. And it's not because something objectively miraculously happens to you. It's you sit one night in a crowded bar, you enjoy the taste of a cigarette, and you felt the rush of nicotine. What was it that happened to you that night?
Yeah, my wife thought I should take that bit out of the book. She thought it was a bit embarrassing and cheesy. But yeah, to give a bit of background, I suppose when I first started studying philosophy, I wanted to be a materialist because I love science. I still, you know, obsessed with science and talk to neuroscientists all the time. So I thought that's the scientifically credible option, not like that superstitious stuff I was taught when I was a child. But the more I studied philosophy, I came to think that it can't really account for the reality of consciousness. And I mean, there's a huge debate here, but the core of the problem is that physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas consciousness essentially involves qualities. If you think about the redness of a red experience, or the smell of coffee, or the taste of mint, you can't capture these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of physical science. And so as long as your description of the brain is framed in the purely quantitative vocabulary of neuroscience, you're just going to leave out these qualities and hence leave out consciousness itself, really. So I was persuaded of that. And then, for a while, I just thought, well, it doesn't exist then. If science can't deal with it, then it doesn't exist. And this is a position that's become known as illusionism. A friend of mine, Keith Frankish, is a proponent of this, thinks, science can't account for consciousness, so it doesn't exist. It's, it's just, it's like magic or fairy dust or something. And I really try to believe that, and I debated that, and I defended it to the hilt. But I don't know what it was about that one particular night when I was just trying to, I guess I was out of debate mode, and I was just absorbed in these rich experiences and just the qualities of my experience, the rush, the colors, the sounds, the tastes, the smells, just the reality of them, the undeniable reality of them struck home in a way that I just couldn't really hold the intellectual position I had tried to hold to. It was a sort of clash between theory and lived experience, and I just couldn't live with it anymore. Yeah.
So what consequences? I know this is not like a revelation. This is more like something that you have this dialogue with yourself, and you're debating someone, and you're debating yourself, and we have this ongoing inner deliberations all the time. You read something, and then you have an experience that is like an argument in that inner deliberation, more like, it's not like a mystical experience. It's not like described like that.
No, it wasn't mystical. Yeah, I mean, I guess as a philosopher, I'm always doing that, actually, and I try to get my students to do the same, as attacking my own position, like as you know, a court situation in my head of trying to attack my own position to see if it withstands scrutiny. And but at that point, no, it wasn't a mystical experience. It was, I had decided intellectually, and I still think this, that our standard scientific approach, our current scientific approach, so not science, right? Not science, but I don't think we should be careful not to confuse an allegiance to science with a dogmatic commitment to our current scientific approach. So I'm inclined to think that, you know, our current scientific approach can't account for the reality of experience, subjective, qualitative experience, the colors, the sounds, the smells, and the tastes. So intellectually, I decided experience didn't exist. I was just a complicated mechanism, and my brain was playing a trick on me, making me think I experienced all these colors and sounds and smells and tastes, but I didn't really. I just thought I did. And it was just, so it wasn't a mystical experience, but just vividly feeling the reality of ordinary experiences, the rush of nicotine, the taste of lager or whatever, that made me see that's not true. It's evidently not true. Because I mean, I agree with Descartes that the thing that we are most certain of is the reality of our own experience. And so it's peculiar to get yourself into a situation where what is less certain, I mean, one way of looking at this is science is only possible because of consciousness. You know, we're only able to experience the results of experiments through our own consciousness. Consciousness mediates all knowledge of the world. So it would be peculiar if scientific knowledge could give us reason to doubt the reality of consciousness. As I say in the book, it's a bit like astronomy giving us reason to doubt telescopes or something. We use our consciousness to know about the world. Yeah, so not a mystical experience, but just a vivid sense of the reality of experience. Yeah.
And I think that's the very interesting turn in your book, that you say, well, in the scientific worldview that was established by Galileo and that we've come to take for granted, then we know and predict the objects around us, but the consciousness we either call an illusion or we invent a dualism, so it escapes this frame of explanation. And they say, let's start with the consciousness instead. Let's say, well, this is actually what we know the best. Let's make that the epistemological starting point, our own consciousness. And you draw some very interesting consequences from that. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the reason for the title of the book is, I mean, I don't think we should be surprised that our current scientific approach struggles to deal with consciousness, because if you look back at the history, our current scientific approach was designed to exclude consciousness. So in 1623, Galileo, the father of modern science, says, right, from now on, science is going to be purely mathematical, purely quantitative. But Galileo was also a great philosopher, and he understood that you can't capture the qualities of consciousness in these terms, the colors, the sounds, the smells, and the tastes. So he said, well, if we want science to be purely mathematical, purely quantitative, we have to take consciousness outside of science. We have to put it in the soul, outside of the domain of science. So in Galileo's worldview, there is this radical division between two domains: the quantitative domain of physical science, the physical world with its mathematical properties of size and shape, location and motion, and the domain of consciousness with its qualities of color and sound and smell and so on, outside of the domain of science. So, and this, I think this is really important. So it was only once consciousness was out of the picture that mathematical physics was possible. So this is really important, because I think the reason people still cling to materialism is the idea that, look at the success of science. It's, of course, science has gone so well, physical science. Of course, this should give us confidence it'll one day explain consciousness. But I think that's the wrong way to think about the history of science. It's gone so well precisely because it was designed to exclude consciousness quite explicitly. So if we want to solve the problem of consciousness, we need to find a way of bringing together what Galileo separated, the quantitative domain of physical science and the qualitative reality of consciousness. We need to find a way of bringing them together into a single unified worldview. And I think there are ways of doing this, which I can explain if you like.
I was thinking of that when I was reading your book. I think it's a very good title of the book. You know, it's just like, it almost sounds like a movie. It's just, you know, Galileo's era. But maybe the title could be a little misleading, because what you're suggesting is actually not that Galileo was wrong, but that the next subsequent generations were wrong, and that was actually the reading of Galileo saying, well, this is all there is. Isn't that correct? That at least I thought first that you were saying that he was wrong, that it was his error. But then the point is that he knew very well that this was not the investigation of all things in the world, all phenomena in the world, that consciousness was not included in that.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right there. It's a provocative title. I can't claim credit, actually. My friend, the philosopher Nigel Warburton, suggested it to me. But it's, I mean, as you say, in a way, I think I'm a huge fan of Galileo. And he got it completely right. I think we're now going through, you know, humans always think they're at the end of history, and they've kind of got it basically right. But I think we're now living through a period that I think historians of the future will look back at as a period where we were so totally blown away by the success of physical science, this quantitative method, third quantitative method, that we thought, that they think, oh, that's everything, that's the total story. And that leads to a nice sense of security. We haven't got all the answers, but we know how to get them. And, you know, this gets into people's identity and their sense of who they are. I mean, people talk of religion as a crutch, but in a way, I think a certain kind of scientism can be a crutch. But the irony is, you know, it's gone so well because it wasn't supposed to capture everything. It was explicitly. But so, what is the error? I suppose, strictly speaking, the error is that Galileo explicitly designed science in such a way that consciousness was inevitably outside of it. And I think if we now, but I don't think that was necessarily a mistake. It was probably necessary for a period of time to set that on one side. What Galileo essentially did was give scientists a more focused task. He said, you know, just forget about consciousness for a couple of 100 years. Just focus on what we can capture in mathematics. But I think it's now time to bring it back in. If we now want a science of consciousness, we need to find a way of bringing back in what Galileo banished from science. It doesn't mean we can't have a science of consciousness. It means we need to rethink what science is, because our Galilean scientific approach was designed to ignore consciousness and is still ignoring consciousness to this day.
So you suggest what you call panpsychism, and we've in this newspaper, we've been flirting with all sorts of new age phenomena over the last 50 years. So everything that has pan in front of it and psychism afterwards, we're a little skeptical. But I want to reassure the viewers and our listeners that this is absolutely compatible with all sorts of rationality. But you also in the book say there is a history of this position. This is not just a position that was invented in 1995, that you go back to Bertrand Russell, and I don't know if you mentioned Whitehead, but he was onto some of the same. So what's the history of this position that you call panpsychism?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to the dawn of philosophy in both West and East, and many of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, Leibniz, Spinoza, were panpsychists. But in recent times, I mean, there's been a rediscovery of it in many ways, and that's been prompted by a rediscovery, as you say, of certain important work from the 1920s by the philosopher and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell, and also by the scientist Arthur Eddington, who was incidentally the first scientist to experimentally confirm Einstein's theory of general relativity. And Whitehead, everyone shouts, lots of people shout at me on Twitter for not mentioning Whitehead enough. But I think Whitehead is a key figure as well here, Alfred North Whitehead. But and this was like tragically forgotten about for a long time. I always say that I think they did for the science of consciousness what Darwin did a century before for the science of life, but for various historical reasons, which we could go into, it got forgotten about for a long time. But it's recently been rediscovered in academic philosophy, has caused huge excitement, lots of publications. And part of what I'm trying to do with this book is get that out to a broader audience. But yes, so the starting point of Russell and Eddington is that physics doesn't really tell us what matter is. And when I first heard that, I thought that's the most ridiculous claim I've ever heard. You know, you read a popular book on physics of cosmology, you know, you find out all these incredible things about the nature of space and time and matter. But I think what Russell and Eddington realized is that for all its richness, physics is confined to telling us about the behavior of matter, about what it does, tells us how particles and fields interact, tells us about mass and charge. And these properties are totally defined in terms of behavior. Things like attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. It's all about what stuff does. But intuitively, at least, and we could perhaps question this, but at least it's coherent to suppose there's more to what something is than what it does. So I like to give the analogy of chess pieces. If you're playing chess, you're interested in what the pieces do, in what moves you can make, what pieces you can take. But if you're someone who collects high-end luxury chess pieces, then you're interested in the substance of the pieces. You want pieces made of gold or silver rather than plastic or cheap metal. So this is what philosophers call the intrinsic nature of a thing, what it is considered independently of what it does. So coming back to fundamental particles, you may very well be interested in what physics has to tell you about what an electron does. Attraction, repulsion, resistance to acceleration. But you may also be interested in the intrinsic nature of an electron, what an electron is considered independently of what it does. And about this, physics just has nothing to say. So it turns out there's actually this huge hole in our standard scientific description of reality. Physics gives us rich information about what stuff does, but tells us nothing about its intrinsic nature. So anyway, so I think that what's this got to do with consciousness? I think the genius of Russell and Eddington was to see the connection to the problem of consciousness. So on the one hand, our current scientific approach gives a purely quantitative description of the brain, and in so doing leaves out the qualities of our experience. On the other hand, physical science gives us a purely behavioral description of matter, and in so doing leaves out its intrinsic nature. So bringing this together, Russell and Eddington proposed a bold hypothesis. Maybe the qualities of experience are the intrinsic nature of matter, from fundamental particles right up to the human brain. So in the 1920s, as I said, in the 1620s, Galileo separates out the qualities of consciousness from the quantities of matter. In the 1920s, Russell and Eddington found a way to bring them back together again. We can think that the quantities of matter about what stuff does and the qualities of matter about what something is, that they're inseparable two sides of the same coin. So we led to a very elegant, simple picture of reality, as you say, can accommodate perfectly well the scientific truth and is not proposing anything mystical or mysterious. Science tells us absolutely what stuff does, but it also accommodates what you might call the human truth of, and by that I just mean the evident reality of our feelings and experiences. It brings it both together in a single unified picture of the world. So that's the basic idea.
And what is very, very challenging as a reader, when I wasn't acquainted with it before, I stumbled upon the word, but I wasn't really forced to go through the reasoning of panpsychism before, is of course this very, that you say, well, maybe consciousness is not exclusive to humans. Maybe we should think of consciousness as something that is not just in our minds, but is on different levels and has different shapes. And also in the beginning, I thought of it as an analogy to my own consciousness. That, well, this, just put it crudely, this chair cannot think like I can. And then I read again, you say, well, actually, you don't say that it has human consciousness. You're saying, well, this has another kind of consciousness. But it is very, very hard to understand that there should be levels of consciousness. How do you explain that? And I know it's a difficult question, but it's your book, so I can ask.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's important, I guess, not to be anthropocentric about consciousness, to model everything on human consciousness, which is, after all, the result of millions and millions of years of evolution by natural selection. So nobody's saying that an electron has the consciousness of a human being, that it's sitting there feeling existential angst or something. But consciousness comes in many varieties, even the forms we know about. That, you know, human consciousness is very complex. The consciousness of a sheep is much simpler. The consciousness of a mouse, simpler again. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of experience. Do bed bugs have experience? If they do, it's so much simpler than that of a mouse, for example. So according to panpsychism, this keeps going down, this process of simpler and simpler forms of life, having simpler forms of experience, just keeps going right down to the basic building blocks of matter, with perhaps electrons and quarks, fundamental particles, having almost unimaginably simple forms of experience to reflect the unimaginably simple structure. I mean, they're incredibly simple structure. And then the thought would be that the very complex structure of the human or animal brain is somehow derived from the very simple experience of the brain's most basic parts. So that's the basic picture. And I mean, part of this is maybe the word consciousness is so ambiguous. We don't mean something like self-awareness or something, you know, reflective awareness of your own existence. We just mean experience. And it's quite coherent for experience to exist in very, very simple forms.
And I think it's very convincing when you say, well, we are the object that we're most familiar with. My consciousness is what I know firsthand, and everything else mediated through that. So that actually makes methodological sense to me, that, okay, I'm the only object that I know like this. So I've never been a chair. I've never been something else. And I see that it really solves the problem of either you put consciousness outside of the material world, or you say it doesn't really exist as the qualities that you mentioned before. But I was thinking that it doesn't kind of remove the you know, we think of human beings as sacred, as being something special, that we are unique creatures in the world, and now it's kind of, there's a scale in panpsychism between the levels of consciousness that challenges the extent to which the human being is something absolutely unique in the world.
Yeah, so the way you started talking then was very much how Eddington thought about it. I mean, I think when you're in the mindset of thinking that physics is giving us this complete story of the nature of the universe, then panpsychism is clearly implausible, because physics isn't telling us electrons have experience. It's hard to see how it could tell us that. But once you've fully absorbed this epistemological starting point, that, you know, epistemology meaning to do with knowledge, this starting point that actually physical science is just telling us what stuff does. It doesn't really tell us the intrinsic nature of anything. It doesn't really tell us what stuff is. Once you really absorb that and you realize that the only physical thing I do know the nature of is my own brain. And I know the nature of that involves a consciousness involving nature. And that's really the only thing I do know about the intrinsic nature of matter. From that starting point, the most simple, elegant, parsimonious proposal is that the stuff outside of brains is continuous with the stuff inside of brains in also having some kind of consciousness involving nature, albeit of a very different kind. But as you say, yeah, I mean, in a way it leads to, as I sometimes put it, a new Copernican revolution, that in the first Copernican revolution, we gave up our privileged place in the center of the universe. In the second, we cast aside the idea that human consciousness is something special, that only human beings have a qualitative as well as a quantitative nature. Human consciousness in this view is just a highly evolved form of what exists throughout the universe. So yeah, in a way, it leads to humans not being very special, but in a way also it's a picture of the universe in which we fit in and we can understand our place within it. We are conscious creatures in a conscious universe. It's a universe maybe we're a little bit more at home in, and we can understand how we fit into it and feel a little bit more comfortable in our own skin, perhaps.
Yeah, and you could turn my point or position around and say, well, it was actually the belief that human beings were unique and the rest of the world were just materials for human beings to realize themselves that led to the destruction of the climate and that led to the destruction of nature, that this position that I am defending because I grew up with the humans being so special, that actually was the worldview, that was the premise of climate change. And the reason why I bring that up is, of course, because you say yourself in the end, in the last part of the book, that panpsychism can also help us not solve climate change, but actually create a mindset that will make us more sensitive to the needs of nature or the objective world around us.
Yeah, so Naomi Klein and others have talked about this, that the inherent dualist picture is very much part of the Western domination of the natural world. I mean, if you think that a tree is just a mechanism, then your conception of its value is just in terms of what it can do for us. Hugging a tree is sort of stupid. It's hugging a mechanism, and we ridicule the hippies of the 60s on this basis. But if you think a tree is a conscious organism, albeit of a very unusual kind, very different to us, then a tree is a locus of moral significance in its own right. Chopping down a tree is an act of moral significance. So, we're all shocked by terrible burning of forest fires in Brazil, for example. If you see that as the burning of conscious organisms, I think it does add an extra moral dimension here. There are countries that have given legal rights to forests, and I saw a philosopher recently in our department give a talk on trying to make rational sense of this. They were desperate to make rational sense of how a forest can have a legal right, if we think legal rights are grounded in sort of moral rights. And I would say it's impossible to make sense of if you think of them as just mechanisms. But if you think of them as conscious organisms, then it starts to make sense of trees having rights in the way philosophers like Peter Singer have come to think of animals as having rights, that we can start to think of tree liberation in the way Singer has thought about animal liberation. And just, more generally in a more subtle way, I think I'm inclined to think our current scientific worldview is inconsistent with the reality of consciousness. So, I'd invite people listening to, again, attend to the qualities of your experience, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the tastes. Our official worldview tells us effectively those qualities don't really exist. All that's really going on in your head is the purely quantitative story of electrochemical signaling. And so I think we're in a strange position where our official worldview denies the reality of that which is most evident, and also that which gives human life value. And, it's consciousness from subtle thoughts to deep emotions that gives life meaning and value. And I think, when your worldview doesn't make sense and doesn't allow you to make sense of the meaning and value of your life, I think people turn to alternative ways of making sense of the the meaning of their life, you know, consumerism or nationalism or fundamentalist religion. So, I mean, I always want to add, as scientists and philosophers, we should be thinking not at the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. I think there's a good case for the probable truth of panpsychism as the best account of how consciousness fits into our scientific story of reality. But I also think it's a worldview that fundamentally makes sense, and within which we can make sense of the meaning and value of our lives. And so I like to think, you know, maybe from that solid foundation, we can perhaps start to build a society that is more rooted in, more consonant with the meaning and value of human existence, those things which I think are difficult to make sense of in our official scientific worldview. So I think in subtle ways, these things do have, worldview does have political as well as philosophical implications.
And my last question goes back to my first question and also relates to what you just said, is that when I read your book, I felt this was this was a book by someone who was very eager to make philosophy important to people. This was a book written to someone outside of the academy. And that can be very difficult because of some of the knowledge that is inherent in science today, and that we must, to a certain extent, understand in order to really meditate on these issues. But you wrote a book that is very, very, very accessible and makes you very, very curious, and it's a very generous book. How do you see the role of the philosopher today? It's like it's like a character from the old days, or you know, you couldn't see a movie about a philosopher today. But yet you really are engaging in public. You're coming here, talking to us at this newspaper, which we are very, very grateful for. How do you see the position and the privilege of being a philosopher in public debate?
Yeah, so I think it is. I think so many people don't really understand what philosophy is, and certainly don't think it has a role to play in finding out about the universe. I think people think maybe it's the job of science to tell us what the universe is like, and then maybe philosophers can come along and make us feel a little bit better about that somehow, or resign us to the reality that science tells us about. But I think philosophy is important in two ways. At the very least, philosophers offer conceptual rigor, analyzing questions and analyzing the logical structure of arguments, and where there are maybe subtle confusions in the way scientists are approaching a question, or there's a need for conceptual clarification. That's one role of philosophy. But I also think that there's a deeper role for philosophy, because I think our current idea of science is that the job of science is to account for the data of public observation.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
I don't know how. Sorry.
No problem.
Thingies, what do you call it? The automated things set up on the computer. So I think the current idea of science is that it tries to account for the data of public observation and experiment. But I think if you religiously followed that methodology, you wouldn't believe in consciousness, because consciousness is not known about on that basis. We know about consciousness not from public observation and experiment, but from our immediate awareness of our own feelings and experiences. If you're in pain, you're just directly aware of your own pain. So I think there are things we know to be real, and we need accommodated in our theory of reality, that don't come from public observation experiments, such as the reality of consciousness, such as the reality of numbers, the kind of entities mathematicians talk about, perhaps facts about value, perhaps facts about human agency. So there are things that we know to be real that we need to fit into our worldview. So I see the job as the philosopher as taking what we know from natural science, but also taking things we know to be real in different ways and fitting them all together in a single unified picture of reality. And I think people are slowly rediscovering that role of philosophy, probably most obviously because of the reality of consciousness that clearly exists and clearly needs to be fitted in somehow. And it's a challenge to see how.
And you've given us such a nice exercise of that, and you've been such a nice example of just doing that right now. Thank you so very much for taking your time and talking to us. It's been a pleasure talking to you and listening to, and I want to recommend your book to all our viewers and listeners. It's really a good read. Thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you, Rune. Thank you so much.